Hello, my name is Adam Hooks, and I am an associate professor in the Department of English and the Center for the Book at the University of Iowa, where my research and teaching focuses on Shakespeare and book history. I am here to help introduce two obscure poems attributed to William Shakespeare that you've probably never read. The first is called The Phoenix and the Turtle, a transcendent, remarkable, difficult, and ultimately rewarding poem on the nature of true love. The poem was initially included in a collection of poetry called Love's Martyr, printed in 1601. This book mostly consists of a poet named Robert Chester's long and obscure narrative poem about the love between the mythical phoenix and the turtle dove. According to the title page, Chester's poem is an allegory shadowing the truth of love, a statement that has inflected the interpretation of Shakespeare's poem. Love's Martyr was dedicated to Sir John Salisbury, a member of a prominent Welsh family, and it may have been intended by Chester as a celebration of this patron's recent knighthood. And it was also printed by Richard Field, who, of course, was responsible for the early editions of Shakespeare's best-selling and renowned narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece. Shakespeare's contribution to the volume appears in a separate section of poetical essays written by the best and chiefest of our modern writers, a group that also included poets and playwrights such as Ben Jonson, John Marston, and George Chapman. Now, Shakespeare's poem was not given a title. It simply begins with an invocation to let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald sad and trumpet be. The figures of the phoenix and the turtle dove are mentioned by name in the poem, which accounts for the title now often used to refer to it, a title first used in the 19th century. Shakespeare's puzzling and difficult poem laments the death and recounts the funeral rites for the two loyal birds who exemplified a perfect union of love, beginning with the gathering of mourners. The poem concludes with a titled Threnos, a song of lamentation, below which appears the name William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's last name actually echoing the rhyme in the final lines of the poem. Now, this poem has often defied the attempts of critics to interpret it, and because of this, it is often overlooked. For instance, scholars are not sure whether or not the birds refer to historical figures from Shakespeare's time or is simply an emblem or a metaphor of true love. My own disposition is for the latter rather than the former. This is a remarkable and astonishing display of poetic skill, as close to metaphysical poetry as Shakespeare ever got to writing. And it is one of my very, very favorite poems in all of English Renaissance literature. Shakespeare's inclusion in this book as one of the best and chiefest of modern writers demonstrates his reputation and renown as a poet among his contemporaries. And as I just mentioned, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, which I introduced in an earlier video, Shakespeare was known first and foremost as a poet of love. Now, the second poem I'm here to introduce is called A Funeral Elegy, and it is not, in fact, written by Shakespeare. It was first published in 1612 and attributed in print to the initials W.S. It appears to be an elegy or a funeral poem for the recently deceased William Peters, who died a tragic and unfortunately violent death. Now, this poem did not gain much critical consideration until the late 1980s and 1990s, when a couple of scholars using computer statistical and stylistic analysis attributed the poem to Shakespeare. Now, an attribution to W.S. is not necessarily an attribution to William Shakespeare, and the poem has since fallen out of complete editions of Shakespeare's poetry, as editors have chosen to believe that Shakespeare did not actually write it. Stylistically, it is very different from his work, and were Shakespeare to have written it, it would be an outlier in his canon, as it remains to this day. Therefore, it is part of what we might call the Shakespearean apocrypha, poems that have been claimed to have been written by Shakespeare based on various combinations of internal and external evidence. For example, some of the plays, which were attributed on the title page to only W.S., were included in the third folio of Shakespeare's works in 1664, even though scholars do not believe he actually wrote those plays. So please enjoy these two poems, Shakespearean poems. One of the most remarkable instances of Shakespeare's poetic output in his entire canon, and the other, perhaps a poem that doesn't belong in the Shakespeare canon and yet can fruitfully be read alongside Shakespeare's other poems about the nature of love. Enjoy!